The screech of tires, the sharp crunch of metal against metal, and then a terrible silence. The kind of silence that only comes when time itself seems to hold its breath. In the middle of that silence, groaning in pain, lay Thomas Reynolds, an aging man in his late 60s. He had always prided himself on being strong, self-sufficient. But now, trapped in the wreckage of his own car, all he had was pain and fading consciousness. The ambulance arrived in minutes, flashing red and blue lights slicing through the night. Paramedics rushed to extract Thomas from the mangled remains of his vehicle. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he heard them mention a name: Dr. Marcus Evans. Thomas barely registered the name, but if he had been in his right mind, he would have scoffed. Dr. Evans was one of the most respected surgeons in the state, but more than that, he was black. And Thomas Reynolds. He had spent most of his life looking down on people like Dr. Evans, clinging to prejudices that had been passed down through generations. As Thomas was wheeled into the emergency room, his vision blurred, but he could make out the shape of a tall man with warm brown skin and a steady gaze. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Reynolds," came a deep, reassuring voice. "Dr. Marcus Evans." Under different circumstances, Thomas would have sneered, would have made some offhand remark about not wanting to be treated by one of them. But now his life hung in the balance, and all he could do was listen as the doctor took charge, his hands swift, steady, and sure. Hours passed. The surgery was long and complicated, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, a ruptured spleen. But Dr. Evans was a master of his craft, and after what felt like an eternity, Thomas was wheeled into recovery. When he woke up the next morning, sore but alive, his eyes landed on the doctor standing by his bedside. For a moment he stared, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. This man, this black doctor, had saved his life. "You did the surgery?" Thomas croaked, his throat dry. Dr. Evans nodded, his expression unreadable. "I did." Thomas struggled with the words, his old prejudices wrestling with something new, something uncomfortable. Gratitude. "I suppose I should thank you." Dr. Evans gave him a small, knowing smile. "I didn't do it for thanks, Mr. Reynolds. I did it because it was my job, because that's what I swore to do, save lives, no matter whose." Days passed, and Thomas remained in the hospital, slowly recovering. Every morning, Dr. Evans would check on him, his professionalism unwavering, his kindness undeniable. And Thomas, for the first time in his life, found himself questioning the beliefs he had held for so long. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the room, Thomas cleared his throat. "Dr. Evans, why?" The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why did you save me?" Dr. Evans sighed, pulling up a chair. "Because I took an oath. Because saving lives doesn't come with conditions. Because hate isn't something I carry into my work." He paused, then added, "And because once, a man not too different from you saved my father's life, despite the color of his skin." Thomas blinked. "What do you mean?" Dr. Evans leaned back. "My father was in an accident when I was just a kid. The doctor who saved him, he was white. A man who, before that day, probably never thought much about people like us. But that day he changed. He saw my father not as a black man, but as a human being, and that moment stuck with me." Thomas swallowed hard. For the first time, he saw not just a doctor, not just a black man, but a human being. A man who had dedicated his life to saving others, even those who wouldn't have done the same for him. The weight of his years of prejudice pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He had spent a lifetime building walls between himself and people like Dr. Evans. And yet, here he was, alive, because one of those very people had chosen to see past the walls. When Thomas was finally discharged, he hesitated before shaking Dr. Evans' hand. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a step forward, a breaking down of old barriers. I was wrong about people like you, Thomas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Evans smiled. I know. As Thomas left the hospital, something inside him had shifted. The world looked different now, not divided by color or race, but by the choices people made, the choice to hate or to heal. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Reynolds chose to heal.